Good.
When someone's lying in the mud and dying in a third world country, there clearly is something wrong. One of the most important issues, the reason this person has got to this point, is that these countries lack the skilled workforce in order to prevent these kind of injuries. They lack the trained doctors because trained doctors are being trained in the country and moving to the more profitable and a nicer lifestyle in the first world countries. And because of that, the people in these third world countries are dying. So ladies and gentlemen, what we propose to do is that the governments of the first world would ban the immigration of doctors from the third world, so simply remove them from the immigration quota. And really there are kind of two broad reasons why we do this. Firstly, we see on several levels this is a principally acceptable restriction of the doctors' freedom to move around the country, to move around the world and do what they like. And secondly, we also see that because this is going to prevent people dying in the third world, and because the issues are far more pressing in the third world than they are in the first, that we're going to see many, many good consequences from banning them from leaving the third world. So firstly, let's have a look at this principal point. So what we're doing here, we accept on the affirmative that we're restricting the freedom of these doctors, right? We're restricting their freedom to move freely amongst the world. But that's okay for three distinct reasons. Firstly, we see that these doctors have been trained in the third world. And in order to be trained in the third world, they've cost the governments and the people of the third world a large amount of money and time that's gone to training. They used up their resources from the teachers and their taxation in order to allow the doctors to become trained in the third world. So they already see that these doctors have been trained by the third world and to some extent a product of the country. So that country has a right to keep them. Secondly, we see that the reason the first world countries should act to improve the third world, and why it's an action from the first world countries, is the first world countries have an historical obligation to the third world. And one of the reasons that the third world is so much worse off now than the first world is because of historical exploitation. And the fact that in the past the first world countries come in there and take what they wanted, who they wanted, from the third world. And we see now that we have an obligation to fix this. And one way of fixing this is to stop exploiting these countries. And one way to stop exploiting these countries is to stop taking the skilled labor that they really need to the first world. And thirdly, we see there's an issue of human commonality, right? We see that well, it sounds obvious, but we are all people. And we all have a duty to other people around the world. So we all have a problem where someone's dying in the third world. And because this policy is going to help implement this, we see no reason why we as humans should not support fellow humans simply because they happen to lie across the border of another country. So, what are the effects of this policy? What's going to happen? Why is it that it's so important that we have these doctors in the third world? So, firstly, we see that the number of doctors in the third world is far less than the number of doctors in the first world. And this is for several reasons. Firstly, in the third world, the amount of people who get like the primary school education, the education they're required in earlier life to become a doctor is far lower, right? There's a far smaller pool of educated people than you would find in the first world. And secondly, we see that the amount of money there in order to further their education, when they become doctors, which is a very expensive course to do, is very low. So even if they had access to these people who they could train as doctors, they don't actually have the money to fund these doctors. So that means that there is an absence of doctors in the third world. Now what does that mean? That means that every doctor in the third world is more valuable than any doctor in the first world, right? Because they're a greater part of the whole. So they have more effect on the general health in the third world than they would be having in the first world because there are less of them. So each doctor is having a greater effect on the proportion of people who are healthy because they're a greater proportion of the total population of doctors. But secondly, we see that health issues in the third world are actually far more pressing than the health issues that we see in the first world, right? Because people in the third world live such horrific lifestyles, because they have such a tough time, they have to work ridiculously long hours in very bad conditions, there's far more cases of like damage and there's far more cases of infection because of like lower sanitation standards and general lower standards of living in the third world. So we see that the health issues that they have, firstly, far more numerous. So far more people are far more likely to get sick in the third world than they are in the first because of the work lifestyle. But when they do get sick, often the sickness is far worse than it would be in the first world because the reasons they're getting sick are very serious. When you live in the third world without adequate sanitation, where a cut can get infected and kill you. Clearly, medical attention is far more needed at this point to fix this cut that could kill you than it would be in the first world, where these things are not as damaging to your health. So we see that the health issues are more important in the third world than they are in the first. These doctors are going to be, again, more valuable in the third world than they would be in the first world, where they're dealing with far more minor issues. So thirdly, then, the real question this comes down to is what's the importance of health? So why is it important that we have healthy people? So on the first level of this is quite simple and quite basic. Simply that you need to be healthy in order to survive, right? That's the definition of health. So we need to allow these people to live. And in order to allow them to live, they need doctors to support their health. But secondly, on top of that, you actually need to have a decent, healthy lifestyle to live out of suffering and live like a human. In order to live like productively in your life and happily in your life, you need a certain standard of welfare and health in order to do that. And that's important for you, obviously, as a person, because it improves the life you have. But it's also important to the country as a whole, because healthier people work better and are more efficient and a more important part of their community than unhealthy people. So we see that the health is particularly important in these third world countries that have these already like lower standards of living and lower standards of workforce. So because we see that it's principally acceptable to restrict the freedom of these doctors to move, and that it's going to lead to many great benefits, what the negative team needs to do is stand up here and tell you is why is it they're happy to let these people die in the third world? Why is it they're happy to allow the first world countries to continue to exploit the third world countries as they've done in the past? And unless they can do that, they're going to lose this debate.
There it is. I pushed the big red button.
Big red button, right? Did you rewind the tape to start off with?
No.
We might have to do that halfway through.
Do you want me to?
Just keep an eye on it.
Okay.
What's the minute time thing?
43, 18, 20, 21, 22.
That gives us 2 more speeches. Before we have to
Okay. We'll go and then I'll rewind soon.
When you're ready, Alec.
On this side of the house, we're perfectly happy to accept that there are people dying in the third world, there are people suffering there, and it would be much, much better if there were a lot more healthy people there. All that the affirmative team in today's debate want to do is leave doctors with no facilities and no possible way of providing their health care to these people to just die and suffer along with the rest of them. We say that what they want to do isn't going to help the third world in any way in terms of leaving doctors there. We say, secondly, that these people are now going to stop training as doctors and nurses, so it's going to avoid any problems, or any benefits that might otherwise accrue. And thirdly, we say that there are actually a lot of benefits to people who are doctors and nurses going to the third world, going from the third world to the first world, actually to both the third world and the first world itself. So firstly, why this isn't going to cure any health problems. And we say that there are heaps and heaps of health problems in the third world. Virtually none of them are caused by the fact that there aren't very many doctors there. One, we say there's a massive lack of infrastructure such as plumbing and things like that there that are available to stop people from getting things like typhoid in these places. We say, secondly, that there's lack of funds, meaning there's lack of any sort of medical care available. There aren't hospitals for doctors to work in. There aren't any form of medical facilities for people to provide for. We say that these people that are suffering and dying in the mud, the reason that there's a concession in that very statement, right? They're living in the mud, apparently. There's not a city there. There's no hospital. There's nothing to treat them, right? Doctor's going to be pretty useful if there's pretty useless rather, if there's nothing for them to do or nothing for them to use. Doctors are a very intense, technology-intensive job, and none of that technology is there. We say, thirdly, that the states aren't in a position where they can provide any of this funding, because one, a lot of them don't have any money, and secondly, a lot of them are completely corrupt, right? Like these states don't actually exist in a really nice moral sphere where they just like put money into lots of healthcare and stuff. The fact is that these states aren't actually investing money in hospitals and in places where doctors can work anyway. Instead, that they're spending that money virtually exclusively on themselves. This is going to come into relevance later in my speech as well. But we say that that is a massive obstruction to doctors being able to do anything. All you're leaving doctors to do then is to live in a situation where they can't use their skills to help anyone, except for, maybe on some level. But that's pretty useless if people are dying from like AIDS and typhoid and horrible diseases and wars or whatever, which is what they seem to be asserting in the third world. We say you're not going to cure any health problems whatsoever from this model. We need a lot more analysis on why leaving doctors with no facilities is going to help people whatsoever. We say on this house, which leads me on to my second point, which is why this is actually going to disincentivize people fundamentally from even becoming doctors and nurses in the third world. Because you know what, it is true, right? Like there are a few facilities and more of them are being provided by like NGOs and so on that exist in these places. We say that that's a slow process, first of all, so our first point still absolutely stands. But you say all you do in this position, right, is disincentivize people from becoming doctors and nurses, because the reason why people become doctors and nurses and then move out of that country is to like live better lives for themselves. We say that these are some of the smartest people that live in these countries in the first place. We say that the problem isn't that the problem is that they have no desire to stay in these countries in the first place. If they're really, really smart, right, they can train in lots of other jobs that are really valuable in other countries and just go as that instead of being a doctor and a nurse, right? So somebody can easily train to be like a computer technician, which is heaps of demand for in the first world and heaps of training for in places like India, rather than going and being a doctor or a nurse. We say instead we're just going to completely disincentivize. So people are just going to opt to train in other disciplines rather than being doctors and nurses anyway. And so even if we started to see a change in terms of allowing people to stay as doctors and nurses in these places, we say that this would actually actively stop people from doing that, because we say that like it's true that if you train more doctors and nurses, more and more of them are going to stay, but if you disincentivize them from training, then less and less of them are going to stay, no matter what you do in terms of providing more facilities. So if we saw an improvement occurring, this policy would stop more doctors and nurses actually staying there because it would disincentivize them from doing them. But thirdly, what are the massive, massive benefits that accrue if we actually allow these people to go to the first world? We say that actually a person who is a doctor or a nurse in a third world country is living in a very different circumstance to when they move to the first world. We say that they end up with a lot of ties back to their homeland, right? So they have family ties. They're usually leaving family members behind. Their whole family aren't doctors and nurses and can't come and like work in hospitals over here. Secondly, they have lots of strong cultural ties to the place that they came from. Often they are associated with tribes or homelands or large groups of people and communities that they come from. We say that those associations very exist. What does that mean that they do when they come to the first world? Firstly, when they come to the first world, they have really nice pay packets, so they're getting a bit more money. This means that they will almost certainly send this money back to their families and help them there. Why is that a good thing? Because as soon as that money exists, right, that boosts that local economy, those families can suddenly afford to eat, which is way more important to being healthy than having a doctor nearby, ladies and gentlemen. And we say that as soon as you start to boost that economy, you get a lot more like infrastructure being able to be built, people being able to eat more healthily, people being able to drink water that's clean, people being able to do these things which massively, like exponentially improve health far more than having a doctor that can help at the bottom of the hill, at the bottom of the cliff, ladies and gentlemen, which is all that they want to help. We say, secondly, there's actually a really good chance that doctors are going to return, right? Because they've got these close cultural connections. They'll go overseas, they'll get a bit of money, they'll pay off whatever debts they might have had like getting their student fees and stuff, and then they'll want to return for those same reasons that I gave you, because they have those associations back home. Why is this a really good thing? It's good, firstly, because they can bring those skills back again with them later on when they're more integrated and possibly gotten even more improved at them, although we still say there's going to be problems with being a lack of facilities. However, we say that there are other things that they can learn in these cultures, and in the first world cultures, that's really important. I've already talked to you about corruption, right? If they come over to these societies and see a culture that exists in a completely different realm in which people aren't corrupt and live in kind of much more morally, sound circumstances where they're much more generous with their money and governments are providing healthcare systems and like that, you get doctors that have been entrenched in this kind of view returning to their homelands later on in their lives, and maybe they'll do things like run for government and become in these institutions and become less corrupt for those reasons. If you force them to stay at home, right, they're left within a corrupt infrastructure, most likely only working for the most wealthy people and corrupt people within that country. They don't help anyone who's actually dying because they can't do it, because there's no resources for them to be able to do it. We say on this side of the house that their policy only makes things much, much worse. We absolutely oppose.
Right, go. Yeah.
Apart from being absolutely morally repugnant to say we don't care about the lives in the third world, it was also totally ignored our entire case, because we gave you reasons as to why we should care about the people in the third world, and there were 3 of them. And to win this debate, they actually have to address these, because if we can prove there's an obligation on first world countries to keep the doctors in the third world, then we win. So there were 3 reasons that Kieran came up with. The first one was, he said that they were trained under the resources of the people in the third world. We say therefore that those countries in the third world have a legitimate claim to use those doctors to help provide for their people, because they took out the initial cost to train them in the first place. The second one was, we said that there's an obligation on first world countries to be altruistic to the third world. Why? Because in the past there's been historical exploitation of things like colonization and people going and taking advantage of people in Africa, which causes many of the problems in terms of people in poverty which exist at the moment. So we say, given that historical wrong, we say there's a duty on first world countries to provide a historical right. The third thing we told you was about human commonality. We said the fact that suffering in the third world is far greater, like we're talking about lives at stake, rather than like whether you've got the flu or not, that it is far more important, given that human commonality and connections and sympathy we have around the world, that we care with those people in the third world. So given that, they have to come up with some reason as to why we should basically let them survive. Now I'm going to get on to this point about, oh well, there's no infrastructure, therefore like we don't need doctors. Okay. So why are some doctors in the third world, or why is it better to have as many doctors in the third world as possible? Okay, the first problem with your analysis about, oh, there's just no way they can do anything, is completely wrong, because a lot of health issues require preemptive knowledge. What do I mean by that? Like, you can take precautions and tell people in your population to stop taking certain actions which are likely to lead them to contract diseases like AIDS or contract diseases. But moreover, we're not just talking, there are a whole range of like sicknesses, right? Things that can be treated without necessarily having like a first world hospital, right? Like, you only need certain equipments. And in addition, they told us, and what was analysis I was going to bring up anyway, is that there are like NGOs and UN groups who come in and provide these facilities anyway for the doctors to work at. So we say that to the extent, you know, that there's no facilities, we say, A, it's better to have like 50 doctors in the third world and no facilities, rather than no doctors and no facilities, because at least then there are people who actually are there to actually do something in sense. The next thing they told you was that no one will train to become doctors because like people, you know, are totally motivated by money. Okay, that's completely wrong. The biggest reason why people in third world countries become doctors is because of the suffering they see of those around them in third world countries. There's an ad on TV that was related to World Vision where the girl stood up and said that she wanted to train doctors, and it wasn't because she wanted to become really rich and move to Australia. It was because she cared about her family and her extended family suffering around them. So we say that leaving those doctors there is best. But then that leads on to the question of why do the doctors actually leave the third world countries? And we say the reason for that is often they leave on a false premise that they'll be able to go to a first world country and train. So what are the situations here? Often what happens when a doctor immigrates from a third world country to a first world country is that they're not able to become a doctor in much time soon. Why? Because there is a whole new set of tests and barriers to them becoming a doctor in that country. That's why a lot of doctors from my right suddenly become taxi drivers in New Zealand, right? And what that means is that it takes like 12 or like, you know, 8 or 9 years for them to retrain to be a doctor in New Zealand. It does. Like, I can tell you, I know someone whose parents, and this is true, took 7 or 8 years once coming from Iraq to become a doctor in New Zealand. And what that means is that they're unlikely to ever, you know, go back in the first place. But in addition, we say that choice for them to be a taxi driver is really bad. We'd rather force them to stay in that country because of the benefit of them helping sick people is so much better than them being like a taxi driver in New Zealand or whatever. They never responded to the analysis of the contextual analysis, and that's going to be my third point, the context of the third world, why it's so important to have doctors there. And we told you that there are necessarily less of them. And you know, they basically agreed and said, oh well, so they can't do anything. And then another thing we want to point out in terms of doctors in the third world is that they actually function as role models for like those wanting to become doctors. So also becoming doctors out of altruistic means, but also helping other people become doctors. You know, is it going to be easier to help someone else to become a doctor when you're in that country or when you're stuck in another country? And like their whole case is like premised on they'll immigrate back. But if they've taken all these costs and all these steps to become a doctor in the first world country, there's no way they're going to undermine undermine, 5 or 6 years of work that it became to a doctor to go back in there. And we told you that these doctors necessarily have a greater level of knowledge about the problems which exist in their own country, right? A doctor in Africa knows the specific localities and the sicknesses which exist. And we say, so for them to leave is actually a really bad thing. So we say at the end of this debate, you got a choice. You either have, some doctors and some level of care for those in the third world, or you have nothing. We say something, and we say something is better, and we've justified why that something is better with our principal analysis, which Alec never touched. So we propose.
Thank you very much, Alec. The final substantive speaker for this debate will be Toby Yuretich.
Ladies and gentlemen, the affirmative team tonight has spent a lot of time convincing you that it's very important that the third world be helped out, ladies and gentlemen, and convincing you that the situation is bad in the third world. We heartily agree with that. But for them to accuse us of not properly answering their points, ladies and gentlemen, and then to completely ignore our arguments, which have shown you that their proposal simply won't improve the situation, ladies and gentlemen, it shows that they completely have misunderstood the debate and at this point have almost certainly lost. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at 3 key questions. First of all, will forcing doctors to stay in these countries actually improve the health of anyone in these countries? Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, will putting these limits in place actually increase the number of doctors in these countries? And thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, are there any benefits to doctors leaving that the affirmative team have ignored? So let's look at the first question. And what we've told you, ladies and gentlemen, at first, is that the problems in third world countries go much deeper than a simple lack of doctors. The problems there, ladies and gentlemen, is that they have no facilities. They have no decent sanitation, ladies and gentlemen. They have no access to medicine. And the only answer that the affirmative team has had to this is that, well, surely some doctors are better than none, ladies and gentlemen, because they can provide information. Now, what they failed to mention is that the kind of information you can give out, the kind of help you can give, ladies and gentlemen, with absolutely no facilities and no sanitation, is more or less limited to telling people to boil water, ladies and gentlemen, and not have unprotected sex. Now, we say that you do not need to spend years and years and thousands of dollars training someone to become a doctor so they can give out that kind of information, ladies and gentlemen. They've told you that there are NGOs going in, but those NGOs take doctors with them, ladies and gentlemen, from the first world. So there's not a shortage there. And finally, we say that the doctors you have in these third world countries, because there's so much corruption, will only end up helping the richest in those countries, because the poor people are so poor, ladies and gentlemen. They can't afford medical care. Even if you force doctors to stay, they either won't be able to find a job because there's no hospitals, ladies and gentlemen, because there's no facilities and there's no money, or they'll get sucked in to providing care for the corrupt, rich governments, ladies and gentlemen, and they'll be helping the people who don't need any help because they're already rich, because they can already afford anything they need, ladies and gentlemen. So we say that their proposal simply won't improve the health there. Secondly, let's move on and look at the question of whether it will actually increase the number of doctors you have in these countries at all. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, that it won't. Because the problem you have, the reason that there's a shortage of doctors in these countries, is because nobody wants to be a doctor in a third world country. We say, if the doctors are training as doctors and then promptly leaving the country and never coming back, what that shows you is that they never had any intention, they never had any desire to practice medicine in that country. These are the best and the brightest in those countries, ladies and gentlemen. If all they want to do is get out, and you prevent them from doing that as a doctor, they'll train as an engineer and get out that way. They'll train as a computer scientist, ladies and gentlemen, and get out that way. They'll do whatever they can. They'll do something else and leave anyway. So we say, ladies and gentlemen, that the problem, the underlying problem, isn't simply that doctors can leave. It's that they're choosing to leave, that these people are choosing to get out of the country. We say simply putting in a limit on the doctors that can leave won't change that situation. It'll just mean that the people they're trying to get to stay won't train as a doctor in the first place, ladies and gentlemen, which we say is a worse situation. So, finally, let's look on to the question of whether or not there's actually any benefits to the doctors leaving. And ladies and gentlemen, we say that there are some benefits, that even if they leave to become a taxi driver in New Zealand, that can still be better for those countries than it would have been if they'd stayed, ladies and gentlemen, and died in the mud alongside their countrymen. So we say, first of all, as Alec told you, they're quite capable and do, in most cases, send money back into those countries so their families, ladies and gentlemen, can afford to eat. We say that that's much, much more important than having an extra doctor who can't do anything because they've got no facilities, ladies and gentlemen. The problem that you have in these countries, as I've told you, as Alec has told you, is to do with nutrition. It's to do with not having any money, ladies and gentlemen. So even a taxi driver's wage in New Zealand is much, much higher than they would have been earning back in their own country. So we say that that's a benefit. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we say that they can get more training, that in first world countries, they can do more training. And the only answer that the affirmative team has on this point is that it might take a while, ladies and gentlemen. That they'll have to spend years in the first world country doing something else before they can become a doctor. Ladies and gentlemen, we say, because we've shown you that there's absolutely no benefit to them staying in the third world countries, that's not a problem. We say, even if it might take 10 years, eventually they will get back. And when they get back, ladies and gentlemen, they've spent years in a first world country, earning a first world wage. They now have money. They have experience, ladies and gentlemen. They've worked in first world hospitals. They've got the experience in the first world medicine system. So they can go back. They've got the money they need. They've got the experience they need. Then, ladies and gentlemen, they can actually help. So because the affirmative team's proposal does absolutely nothing to help the third world countries, which is the people they've spent the whole debate talking about, ladies and gentlemen, the moot must fall.
Paul, are we meeting in here tonight?
Sorry?
Are we meeting in here tonight?
Yeah, but we sort of replies quickly.
Yeah, completely.
Oh,
But could somebody
do you want me to
stand in
wave
the doorway and
people?
just wave people in? Yeah. I'd now like to welcome Alec, the first speaker for the negative team, to give the reply.
The
two principles that Paul said we ignored in this debate were one, that corrupt countries somehow have a right to be able to use doctors that they've trained, which we disagree with completely. Secondly, that somehow we don't care about countries in the third world because this is somehow going to benefit them. We say we agree with the principle that this is about what is going to be best for the countries in the third world, and we've fundamentally and easily shown you on this side of the house that it's better if we don't implement these policies for those countries. 3 questions in this debate. Will this actually help? Will this actually increase the number of doctors or nurses, and are there current benefits with the current system anyway? Firstly, will this actually help? We say that the bizarre response that we had to our point that there's just not enough facilities for doctors to be useful was that doctors have lots and lots of really useful knowledge to tell people what to do and what not to do. Well, we say that quite simply, a lot of that knowledge is really easy to spread anyway, and is already being spread by people who aren't doctors in these countries. Not taking condoms, boiling your water, very, very simple. We say that those benefits are fine. And that's pretty much the only benefit that they were left with on that side of the house, right? That, a few doctors being able to spread knowledge was good. We say that the benefits that we've shown you on the current system are a lot better, and the harms that we've shown you are going to continue to exist. We also were able to show you that actually what is actually going to happen is doctors end up serving the rich and the corrupt governments of these countries rather than helping anybody in poor scenarios. Anyway, we think that that's a bad thing. And we think that thirdly, if they want to talk about NGOs being able to employ doctors like Medicine Sans Doctors Without Borders, for example, the point of Doctors Without Borders is that people from the first world go to the third world and be doctors there. We say that NGOs actually have a lot of their own doctors from the first world already. So secondly, are doctors going to be able to train as will people train as doctors and nurses anyway? We had no response from this from Paul at second affirmative, right? We say that there's absolutely, that there's, if people are interested in leaving the country to get higher wages outside of that country, then they're not going to train as doctors and nurses, they're going to train as engineers, they're going to train as computer scientists instead, because we're talking about people who are smart, good at science and maths, they can train in other things and go and do that. We heard nothing on that from the affirmative side of the house. We say that that still stands. And thirdly, we say that actually the current system does do good things for the third world. We say that, one, taxi drivers actually earn quite a lot of money, so they can still send it back. 2, taxi drivers learn quite a lot about the culture, so they can still return and do that kind of thing. So we say, it's not necessarily a bad thing if people are working as taxi drivers. But secondly, Paul's it'll take 7 or 8 years for them to get there. Well, do the maths, Paul. 7 or 8 years isn't very long, right? You're still talking about 15, 20-year careers in New Zealand or wherever, earning money that they can send back as proper doctors, learning a lot about society and how not corrupt it is and stuff, and being able to go back and deal with that as well. We say that the benefit absolutely still holds on this side of the house, that people are still going to be sending money back, that people are still going to get all of those benefits otherwise. So that benefit's still going to exist. So the affirmative team in this debate tried to stand up here in Kieran and tell us that, health is really great in the third world, as if we were ever going to disagree with that. We say that this doesn't improve health in the third world because you're still not building hospitals, because you're still not giving doctors anything they can use. We say that no one's going to train as a doctor or nurse if you don't let them leave the country. And we say that thirdly, leaving the country actually ends up being a really good thing anyway. For these reasons, we oppose.
Cool, thank you. Yeah. Wait, so there's somebody outside?
What are you doing?
We've been waiting here for
Oh, okay, that's fine. No, it's all good, it's all good. As long as you can see them.
Yeah, because we can see them up.
Thanks, Kieran. Spot on, so.
Just setting up the computer, I think. Or whispering advice.
We're just going to stay ventriloquism.
Yeah.
We kind of Paul's voice starts coming.
I think we're noticed, to be honest.
Yeah, probably.
Should I just go? Right, sorry.
You should just.
Okay, I will just go. What the negative team has failed to grasp throughout this debate is that people make 2 decisions when they become a doctor and leave the third world. They make the decision to become a doctor, and they make the decision to leave the third world. And those 2 things are distinct. When Paul stood up in second and told you why it was people wanted to become doctors, he gave you some very good analysis of why people become doctors, and the reason is that they want to help the people around them, right? So people decide to go out there and become a doctor because they've seen this horrific suffering. They've seen just how bad it is in the third world, and they decide they want to be a doctor. However, the reason that they leave is having now become a doctor through a long period of training, they're exposed to a harsh reality of just how hard it is being a doctor, right? Being a doctor in the third world isn't nice. And that's when they've been like blunted to the trauma that they've seen around them by being a doctor in these horrific conditions, that's when they choose to leave the third world. So that's the reason why doctors will continue to be trained throughout, in the third world, even if they have to stay. So when we stood up here and proved this principal point to you, we proved to you why it was okay to restrict their freedom to keep doctors within the third world. And because we've done that, we need to prove any benefit at all to keeping these doctors in the third world to win this debate. And we actually proved some pretty substantial benefits to why we should, why it's good to have these doctors left in the third world. So firstly, the negative team has full of hugely gross false characterizations. So first it up and said, there are no facilities in the third world for these people to work. Now, that's just empirically untrue, right? They admitted themselves there are NGOs in these places that provide the facilities for doctors to work in. And furthermore than that, the NGOs are more likely to be there if they have the doctors around to make use of their facilities. So it'd be better to have the doctors there and send the aid than to have neither there in the first place. But furthermore than that, we told you what else doctors can do. And we gave you a good analysis of other things doctors can do. And they've sort of like rubbished this point about the knowledge that doctors have. And that's because they didn't quite understand it. So what we said is that doctors have a knowledge and they can use this to inform people. And they can inform people on like safe lifestyles. But of course they can also inform people on like what they've got, right? Doctors are able to diagnose people and tell them about what they need to do about their lifestyle. And that's very specialized knowledge that is required to be a doctor. And finally on top of that, there are plenty of simple diseases you can treat. And I stood up here and said this in first. These people in the third world are not just dying of AIDS. They're also dying of infected cuts. And the number of facilities you need to treat infected cuts is very low. But you do need a doctor there to know there's something wrong in order to treat this. So we see there's this huge benefit to having that. And then finally, the question about the benefits of the doctor, whether the doctor can bring benefits by being in the other country. Right? So the negatives team's horrific analysis is it would be better to have these doctors out of the country, being taxi drivers in our country, sending a few dollars back to their home country, than it would be to have the doctors in the home country doing what they've trained to do, to be doctors within that country. The negative team, for some reason, seems to think that's a better use of the doctor's time and a better way to help these third world countries. And the question of how long it takes to become a doctor, right? 7 to 8 years is actually quite a long time. And after that time, they're very unlikely to come back, as Paul said. And furthermore, throughout those 7 to 8 years, those people who could have been helped by this doctor are still dying because the doctor's not there to help them. So, for all those reasons, we are still very, very happy to affirm.
Cool, thanks guys. I think we might be outside.
Yeah. Thank you.
That allowed us to
Cheers.
put on.
Cheers, Toby.
Thank you very much. It's fun.
Cheers. We might